Well, we're going to take a look today at the Kreg Adaptive Cutting System. This is Kreg's version of the track saw. They've taken this whole idea of a track saw a step further, and the saw not only comes with a track, but it comes with its own table that's designed to be used with it. The Kreg Adaptive Cutting System consists of three main pieces. That's the saw itself, the track, which is normally mounted to the table, and the table itself is the third piece. Now you can use the saw on the track without the table and just use it as a regular track saw. But before you try and use the saw, might I recommend that you read the instructions? I'm an engineer, okay, and engineers live by the adage that owner's manuals and instructions were created for lesser beings. We're engineers and we can figure it out ourselves. Well, I'm glad that I decided to look at the instructions on this because there's a number of things that I found in the instructions that I may have messed things up had I not read them. Although this basically looks like it's a circular saw, it is different than any circular saw you've ever encountered in your life. Unless maybe you've worked with some other track saw and they have the same features. I don't know, I've never worked with a different track saw. First of all, it's a plunge cut saw. And what that means is that to make a cut with it, you've got a dual trigger system, and then you actually push the blade down into the material, okay? What that means is when you're not cutting, the blade is totally encased here, very, very safe, but it also helps with the accuracy of the cut. Because it's a plunge cut saw, we need to be very concerned about the depth of cut. There's a depth of cut gauge right here, and it's adjustable, and you can set the maximum depth your blade is going to go to. And that should be a 1/4 inch past the thickness of your material. The reason that's so important isn't so much if we're just using it with the track, but if we're using it with the table. Because we don't want to cut through the tabletop. We will cut into the tabletop in the process of making our cuts, but we only want to cut in a little bit, a 1/4 inch. It's a 3/4 inch thick top. If we cut in a 1/4 inch, we haven't really damaged the top. And we'll just actually, we'll create a saw curve there that we'll keep using over and over again. And that will help with the cleanliness of our cuts. One of the things a saw does, because it's a track saw and because of the way it's designed, is it does give you very clean cuts. This is a piece that I've off-cut from some weathered plywood. I had brought this home and I hand cut it with a cordless circular saw, and as you can see, it wasn't straight, okay? Now, you can't see it from there, but this edge, which I cut with a handheld circular saw, is all splintered. This edge, even though this is weathered plywood, is very, very clean. It's absolutely beautiful. Why is that? Well, first of all, the track has a blue plastic strip along the edge that you actually cut with the saw when you're setting it up, which means that the edge of your cut is always exactly on the edge of that strip, the part of the strip that's left behind. Now, that's typical for track saws. It's even typical for the track saws that people make at home, where they just take some wood and make a track to go with their circular saw, okay? They've added to that and put this right here, this chip breaker or splinter breaker. So we've got on this side of the blade, the track is taking care of it. On this side of the blade, this is taking care of it, and making sure we don't end up with any splinters. So every single cut, we've got a clean edge, even when we're using weathered wood and we're going across the grain. The saw is designed to give you a very, very precise cut. To do that, they've added a few controls that you don't find on your typical circular saw. First of all, there are these two adjustments here, and they both use together. And what they do is they tighten up the saw on the track so that there's no wobble. So every time you put the saw on the track, you want to tighten that up, not tight, but just touching tight, so that the saw will still move freely, but there's no wobble back and forth. Once you've done that, there's an anti-kickback device built into this that also works against the track. And if you turn that on, the saw will not move backwards. It just plain can't. It'll move forward, but it won't move backwards. What about miter cuts? All right, what if we want to do an angled cut? You know, that's something that people do sometimes, and a lot of us avoid doing with a circular saw because it's not very accurate. Well, this will do a 45-degree angle cut. Now, it comes factory set. Okay, all these settings on here are factory set, but they tell you in the instructions how to set them yourself, both so that you can check the factory settings and in case something goes wrong and you need to reset it. It comes with the blade absolutely perpendicular to the shoe, but it also comes with a positive stop. If we remove, there's two of these, one in the front, one in the back, and we can adjust it for an exact 45 degrees. And that's a factory preset 45 degrees, and it will give you an accurate 45-degree cut. If you're trying to do, say, a large box with mitered corners or something like that, and you need to make that mitered cut. They've also included as part of this, there is an override so we can actually go as far as 47 degrees if you need to make a cut that's too big. And coming back the other way to 0, we can actually go to -1 degrees. That's an override. The existing setting is for 90 degrees and 45 degrees, okay, or 0 degrees and 45 degrees. It never changes. As with a lot of saws, it's got a dust bag, dust collection system. The difference between this and a lot of saws is that this one actually works. One other important feature to the saw as far as adjustment is the blade change, okay? There's a switch right here from cut mode to maintenance mode. And maintenance mode is for changing the blade. So you'd switch to maintenance, and then you'd plunge the saw down to expose the blade, and here's your screw for loosening the blade and changing it. The blade is not a 7 1/4 inch blade, it's only a 6 1/2 inch blade, but that still gives you 2 inches of depth of cut. And it's a 48 tooth blade, so it gives you a very, very smooth cut. As I said, I don't see any tooth marks from the saw at all. So with the blade down like this, there's a blade lock, so we can lock the blade in position, undo it, take the blade off, do our maintenance work, bring it back up, switch it back to normal operation mode. As far as the tools for setting it, those are included right here in the handle. There's the Allen wrench right there for changing the blade. And the other Allen wrench is for some of the settings. Like right here, these 2 screws here are for toe in. By toe in, what I'm referring to is how parallel the blade is to the track. So there's a lot of capability built into the saw that you don't find in most circular saws. Is it a circular saw? Yes, but it's a circular saw designed for a very specific purpose, and that is to be used as a track saw. All right, we've looked at the saw. Now let's look at the table. To me, this table is what takes Kreg's track saw and turns it from just being a track saw into something totally different. It increases the capability of the track saw way beyond what we're used to seeing. You know, track saws are basically used just to make straight cuts in sheet grid, and they're great for that. But with the adaptive cutting system, this table, the way it's set up, it allows us to do an awful lot of other precision cutting, almost to the point where it could eliminate the need for a table saw on a job site, okay? First of all, the track is mounted to the table. Now you can take the track off and use it separately, okay? But the idea is that it swings up and swings down so it can lock the pieces in place that you're cutting, okay? There are rubber strips on the bottom here which grip the piece when it is in place. It's between that and the pressure of the saw going in, you don't have to worry about that piece of wood moving at all. Do most track saws have that, those strips on the bottom? Yes, they do, okay? They go a step further and they put a guide here for your vacuum hose and for your cord, so stay out of the way of your cut. When I first unboxed this, I looked at that table and I said, oh great, they give you dog holes. Why do you need dog holes? The saw comes with what they call versastops, which are essentially dogs. You go in the dog holes, and that allows you to set up all sorts of things. You can set up perpendicular cuts, you can set up miter cuts, you can use them to align your pieces, you can use it to make sure your pieces are being straight. That's a great feature in and of itself. The holes are laid out precision, they're an exact grid, so you get exactly perpendicular to the saw blade, or I'm sorry, to the cutting line. You get exactly parallel to the cutting line, you can get 45 degrees to the cutting line. Next thing that comes with is a depth stop, okay? And this is kind of a dual depth stop. There's 2 tracks here, and it's designed to be used as one unit, so you can set up for repetitive cuts. Or you can just set a depth. Let's say I want to cut a piece of wood. I'm making shelves. I want to cut 12 inches. Okay, there's 12 inches. Lock it in. I don't have to measure my board now because it's all measured. I just slide the board in, cut it. It has its own miter gauge, okay, that is considerably more accurate than most miter gauges I see. Granted, you are somewhat limited in the accuracy you can get in a plastic miter gauge, but the big thing they've done here is if you look at the distance between the pivot point and the gauge, you've got a larger distance, so you've got actually a bigger space representing each degree of cut, which helps you set it up more accurately, okay? You can do miter cuts on this, you can do repetitive cuts on this, you can do cross-cutting on it. About the only thing that I haven't seen that you can do with it is to rip a 4x8 sheet of plywood down its length. It's really not set up for that. but just about anything else you can do on this saw. That's what I'm excited about, is the capability that the track saw together with the table gives you. It's very consistent, it's very accurate. Now, granted, the accuracy has a lot to do with you, or in this case me, as the person who set it up, because there are things that we have to set up in the process. Like, for example, these scales have to be set in place, and they have to be set in place accurately. The way we set up the track has to be set up accurately. So there is a fair amount of setup work involved in getting this saw ready to use, but it's worth it. The other thing it's got going for you, which isn't real obvious sitting here, is that it's got a built-in hand truck. You can fold the legs up and truck it off, and you could take this. This could be a job site saw. If you're a contractor, or if you're working on a remodeling project in another part of your house, you can very easily wheel this off to whatever room you're going to be working in, or whatever job site, put it in the back of a SUV, put it in the back of a pickup truck, take it where you need it, set it up, and you've got it available, and you can make all those great accurate cuts wherever you are. One of the things that anybody expects a track saw to do is make straight cuts, right? That's what the whole idea is. You make your marks on your board, set your track up to it, put your saw on there, you've got a straight cut. Well, what if we didn't have to make the marks? What if the saw would do that for us? Okay, that's part of what the table does for us in the adaptive cutting system. Now, I've got a piece of plywood here that I brought home from my mother-in-law's. It had been sitting there. As you can see, it's a little bit weathered. It was just in the way, and she asked me to get it out of there, so I took a cordless circular saw, cut it in half, got what looked like a nice straight line, but when you compare it to this, it's obviously off. Well, I want to straighten it up. Not a big deal, okay? So the table for the adaptive cutting system makes this super easy. I don't have to measure anything. Now, the table's got bench dog holes in it, and they're done in a specific pattern. They're in a square grid, which gives you perfect perpendicular lines to the saw and 45 degrees. So comes with its own bench dogs, which we can plug into those holes. Now I know this board is perpendicular to the track, okay? So all I've got to do is make my cut. So I've cut off my uneven portion there, and I'm left with a piece of plywood that's absolutely square. Now, you can't get much easier than that. The adaptive cutting system comes with its own depth stop, which allows you to set up a dimension that you're going to cut and cut it repetitively. There's two scales, one for narrower cuts and the other for wider cuts. And we can just bring the stop up to that point, and you have to set both sides. There's scales on both sides here, okay? And set it. So I've set this for 8 inches, which allows me to make an 8-inch cut. That's 8 inches from this edge to the edge of my track here, okay? So if we stick a board in there, lock her down, it's ready to go. The way the system's designed to work is this side is always your piece that you are cutting. Anything out here is the leftover or for more pieces to be cut from. So I said we could make repetitive cuts, so let's do that. I'll go ahead and lift it up, pull out my first piece. This is the 8-inch piece I just cut. I can put this in here up to the same stop. I don't have to readjust my stop. Set the track down on it. Put my saw on the track. Okay, so here's my first piece, and here's the second piece, and they're exactly the same width. Because everything is precision manufactured, what that means for us is these holes, as they're laid out, are not only perpendicular to the cut line, parallel to the cut line, but we can go on the angle and get a perfect 45 just by using our bench dogs, okay? Now I've got one of the bench dogs underneath the track here, so this should give me a perfect miter cut, right? Let's give it a try. Well, that looks pretty good, but the real proof of it is when we get two of them and put them together. So let's cut another one. All right, so we've got two pieces cut to form a perfect miter. Put a square on there and make sure. And it is a perfect miter. One of the cuts that this saw is supposed to be able to make is a 45 degree, a very accurate 45 degrees. So it seems to me it's only fair that we test that out as well. So I'm going to go ahead and set it up for that 45 degrees. Now remember, there's a positive stop for this. So I really don't have to worry too much about the setting. I do have to worry about my depth of cut because it's going to have to go a little farther than would normally. I'm going to take one of these pieces I cut before and set it in there. Now, in theory, this should just cut this off at a 45 degree, and it shouldn't change the overall dimension any. That's what I'm thinking anyway. So let's give this a try. I will say it's a little harder to hold the saw at this angle because the weight of it wants to lean it this way, so you kind of have to push it into the track. So here's the piece I cut off. Here's our piece of wood, and that's just about a knife edge right there. So as you can see, it's a nice clean 45. I don't think we have to bother to measure it. And if you were trying to make a box, that would work out really well. You have a nice mitered corner there to work with. One of the things I like to do when I'm testing out a tool is see how far I can push it. I mean, I'll go to the extremes. And really, I've had a hard time doing that with the saw because it is a very capable saw and does what it's supposed to do very, very well. And there's no claims they make like you can cut, you know, stainless steel sheet or anything like that I can really test. But I did find one thing that seems to be outside the purview of the store, the saw, the system, and that is cutting narrow strips. It's really designed for cutting large sheets, okay? Well, sometimes I use some really thin strips of wood for some of the things I'm working on. Can I cut thin strips with this saw? So I thought I'd give it a try, and I've got a piece of 1x12 here, and I'm going to try and cut a 1/4 inch strip off of it. And I think it'll do it, but you know, it's worth a shot, and let's see how it does. Well, it did that nicely. Let's see if we can go even narrower. Let's try an 1/8 inch strip. There it is. Okay, this is actually less than an 1/8. It's about, I'd say 3/32. This is maybe 5/16. And this is the other piece I had that I was using when I was talking about it. So yeah, you can get narrow cuts out of it. It's just a matter of how you set the saw up. Looking at the edge of this board that I just cut, I want to see what kind of teeth marks I've got on here. And I can see tooth marks. No question about it. And there's a little bit of fuzz here where it looks like I cut against the grain. But it's very, very minor, and it's the type of thing that some 150 grit sandpaper would take care of really, really quickly. It's giving me a really clean cut. I would say that cut is good enough that you could edge joint this, or edge glue this. So is it jointing it? Not exactly. Is it good enough for it? Yes, it is. One of the hardest cuts to make in carpentry is cove molding, specifically an outside corner of cove molding. It's a compound miter cut, and it's normally done on a miter saw. It takes a pretty skilled carpenter to get it right, okay? Well, I've been playing around with the saw, trying to figure out the hardest things I could come up with to do with it. I came up with the idea, can I do that? Can I make that cut on this saw? All right? Now, I don't have any cove molding, so I'm just using a couple pieces of particle board, the ones I cut actually before. And what I want to see is if I can make that, because we already know we can do the miter cut, and we already know we can do the 45. So if I put those two together, we should come up with the right cut. Let's try it out. All right, I'll tell you, I messed up just a touch there. I didn't manage to keep the saw leaning all the way over the way it's supposed to. There's my offcut pieces. So here's my 2 pieces of supposed cove molding. There we go. So all in all, the Kreg Adaptive Cutting System is very, very capable. Would I have it as my only saw? Probably not. There are some things I wouldn't want to try doing on this saw, such as cutting small pieces. Now, yeah, I know I cut some narrow strips on here, but there's limits to how much you can do that, okay? Would I want to use it for all sorts of miter cuts? Well, it does have a miter gauge, and it's a pretty decent miter gauge, and it will do those cuts. And as we've seen, I can even do crown molding on it, which I really thought was pushing the limits, okay? There are some other limits too. It's only 55 inches long, so you can't use the track saw portion or the track to cut a piece of plywood down its length. Now I imagine that Kreg sells an extension for the track. You could take the track off the table and do it that way. But for a wide range of things, you know, if I had a cabinet shop, if I was making cabinetry and maybe I didn't have room for a full-size cabinet saw, this would be a great option. Even say for my own. I could see where, geez, back in my construction days, I could see where this would be incredibly useful saw on the job site, probably even more so than the table saw. So I'm sold on it. I think it's an excellent piece of equipment. I think it's well designed. It's well thought out. They've taken the idea of a track saw, and as I said before, they've raised the bar and they've gone another notch up. And by doing so, they've greatly expanded on the capacity of the saw. And this system will do a lot of things that other systems won't.